Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. I hope everybody is doing well. Let me get my screen up for you so we can dive right in because there's a lot to talk about. I will be talking today about connecting digital and traditional environments with extensive reading, and I'm going to be doing that in a couple of ways. Primarily, this will be done through the discussion on the flipped classroom. So you can see here my plan. I'm going to talk about the issue of access, which is very, very important and very important to me, but also how access in the flipped classroom can be mushed together basically with digital technology to make extensive reading a bit more accessible. While I'm going through this, even though we are in an online forum here, I do have a couple of discussion questions that I will be addressing in the presentation, but also so that you can kind of think about them and leave comments or whatever as we go through. So these discussion questions are, what can one teacher do to improve literacy, and how do we create educational access? So these are two pretty big questions. I don't think that they can be answered in one presentation that's only 45 minutes long, but they're definitely well worth having because they bring in so many other spheres of influence. But before we get into that, I want to give a bit of an introduction to my introduction to reading. So here's just a brief timeline of my early stages of learning. So you can probably figure out how old I am from this, but I started formally learning how to read in 1992 when my parents forcibly hooked me on phonics. They responded to the TV commercials and bought these phonics books and the cassettes and made me sit down on a semi-regular basis and go through the curriculum of the Hooked on Phonics program. And I did that for about a year and then moved on to their Reading Power program, which was a graded reader attachment. But something more important than the graded reader attachment happened in 1993. I am a huge baseball fan. So between reading and baseball, those are kind of my two religions. And so baseball and reading are very connected, and I will explain why very soon. But in 1993, my hometown team, the San Francisco Giants, were one game away from making the playoffs, and they were annihilated in that game. And nothing makes a real fan like heartbreak. So at the end of the 1993 season, I suddenly was very invested in baseball and getting prepared for the next season. I was following things. I was watching the news with my parents and talking about sports, and I wanted to start playing baseball. And so when we jump to 1994, the season's starting, I'm very excited. But as it happens, the San Francisco Public Library started a summer reading program that year. And in that summer reading program, there were a series of rewards and prizes that you could get for reading a certain number of books. But the final reward were Giants tickets. So I had my motivation. I was ready to read. And I jumped at the opportunity, not because I wanted to read books, but because I wanted to go to a Giants game. But a weird thing happened while I was doing this summer reading program. I learned how fun reading was. It's thanks to the man on the left up there at the top of the screen. That is Munro Leaf. And he wrote a book called The Story of Ferdinand. And that was the first, what would be called a home run book. And that was the book that got me hooked on reading. I wanted to keep reading, and I wanted to read more and more because of that book. I still own a copy of this book. So it was really important. So those two men up there were very important to my reading and baseball life. Munro Leaf and Matt Williams up there on the right is my favorite player to this day. Now, jump 2 years to 1996, and I go from reading simple books, simple children's books like The Story of Ferdinand by Monroe Leaf, and suddenly I'm reading everything. And this is why that one home run was so important, because it led me to find all of these other books and resources to find books. One of those resources came from a teacher's aide that I had who would come into our class maybe twice a week for a semester. And on those days that he came in, he would sit with us and he would read Macbeth. And we were far too young to fully understand the story of Macbeth or who William Shakespeare really was. But having him sit there and read and give context to the story through the way in which he read the characters, the discussions after were really, really important to helping me find other things that might interest me. So there were a couple of different tendrils of interest that got me there. But 1996, I think, is still to this day the year that I read the most. I was very excited to continue on. So 1996, from there on, the rest is history. And it's probably why I'm an educator now. Now, what I did to read all of these books was I went to the library. I was very fortunate to have 2 libraries in my neighborhood. So I was always in pretty close contact with books. I had that access. So once my parents stopped forcing me to read, I was forcing them to take me to the library. And this brings up the question of access. So Dr. Stephen Krashen had said this in a lecture that he gave in 2016, quote, "The biggest problem we have in literacy and in education in general is, of course, poverty. Children of high poverty have practically no access to books." And then later on, he continued that reading can counter some of the effects of poverty, and it's the amount of reading you do, not your social class. And I was definitely more fortunate than many people, but I was also not one of the very wealthy people. I didn't come from a family with a lot of money. So the library was so important to me because I could get so many more books. But if I lived in an area where I didn't have that access, I don't know that I would have ever gained the interest and the sustained interest to read. So what I want to talk about is that book desert. Maybe you've heard this term, or you probably have heard more commonly the food desert. It's a very popular topic of discussion in sociological circles, but the lack of books or the lack of food, healthy food, specifically fresh fruit and vegetables, these are important points of study. And when we're talking about books and the book desert, the facts are that the poorer the child is, the fewer books are available to them. And because there are fewer books, children have poor reading skills because they lack the proper reading materials. This also means that they have a lack of motivation to read later on, or continued lack of motivation. And to put this in broad terms, it's that poverty reduces proximity. So libraries are essential, but if you don't have access to the libraries, they're not going to do much good to you. This is also exacerbated by a couple of other institutional problems that we have and we can observe. In Korea, especially, there has been a rise in something called like a for-profit library. So academies will develop, private academies will develop their own libraries that you pay a subscription to join. And this exacerbates the problem because only the people that can afford to go to those libraries are able to use them. And so we're creating a bigger gap in reading literacy. Legal limitations on learning favor the wealthy as well. So any sort of law that puts restrictions on when, how, or why students can learn favor the wealthy, because the wealthy can always go and find private tutors that are outside of these jurisdictional laws. We're seeing that a lot, I think, or we're starting to see that a lot this year in China. And then The other sad fact is that public education does not level the playing field. Because public education is not an equal playing field either. Schools in poor neighborhoods and poor communities have less funding, and therefore they have fewer resources. So the students are going to struggle in that case versus schools and students that go to school in wealthier areas. So these are the problems that teachers have to deal with. And really, the best way to improve young learners' reading fluency is, as ideal as it sounds, is to have a stack of books within walking distance at all time. And if that stack rotates in variety, that's even better. But that's the ideal. So this leads me to that first discussion question. What can one teacher do to improve literacy? Now, the obvious answer and the most impossible answer is solve poverty. But one teacher can't do that. So the suggestion that I'm going to talk about today is incorporate the flipped classroom. This is a small scale change that one teacher can incorporate, and it works very well with extensive reading programs. So a quick crash course on the flipped class. The flipped class, as the name describes, flips what students do at home versus what they do in the classroom. So at home, students are given time to self-study. And then they apply what they study at home in class. So this allows students to learn at their own pace, and it increases class efficiency and engagement because the teacher is freed to do more dynamic things in the class. One of those things being that teachers are afforded more time to give individual and targeted attention. And the more attention that each student gets, the better the better chance they have at improving. When you have a flipped class, in-class activities should be group-oriented, they should be gamified, and they should be student-forward. And this changes because the teacher is no longer at the front of the class lecturing, but hovering around the perimeter or working with individual students. So we're getting more into that facilitator role. And homework is completed in class. So instead of using workbooks and worksheets to cover comprehension at home, the students are doing it in class where they get immediate feedback from their teachers and from their peers. And this is great because a student who struggles at home is more likely to give up on doing the homework and just not completing it. Maybe their parents can help them, but we can't always guarantee that parents will be there, especially in an impoverished area. And even if a student is completing their homework and they have a question, they are still required to remember that question for the next day or the next class. So the feedback is very, very delayed, and that can be a bit of a problem. Now, with an extensive reading program, there are a couple of things that I would recommend doing when you have a flipped class. First, in class, to plan your class, have your students choose their books, but have them read them at home. And what you can do is you curate a selection of books based on their levels and their interests. Using graded readers is a great way to do that. But give them a choice. It doesn't have to be too many books, but give them 5 or 6 books to choose from. And then based on what they choose, you divide those students into groups. So for their next class, they will be working together based on the same topic. So that's really, really useful for getting students to work together. When you're in the class as well, it doesn't mean that you can't have extensive reading time. So using DEAR time or sustained silent reading is great, but also teach your students how to read in class. We're dealing with young learners here, so teach them how to limit distraction. Teach them to find places that they feel comfortable with. So you're using the classroom as a lab for how to create good reading habits. And that's something that often gets missed. We just say often to our students, go read a book, enjoy it. But we don't tell them, maybe you should have a cushion under you when you read, or maybe if you like to walk around, walk around. If you need a tea or a soda or something like that, these are things that we can remind our students. And finally, make sure that you're creating activities that allow students to demonstrate what they've learned or read about, not the other way around. We don't want to shoehorn the stories into activities. We want the students to be able to incorporate any form of knowledge that they've acquired and use it for an activity. And I'm not going to go into great detail about what extensive reading is, because I'm pretty sure we're all pretty familiar with it. But the one thing that I do want to point out about the flipped class in extensive reading is that while your students are going through this cycle of extensive reading, there are little things that you as the teacher can do. And this does require some sort of communication with parents as well. But one of the big things is, since they're reading at home, since the students are reading at home, encourage their families to participate in that. Encourage your families to do reading time together, or do something where the students can teach an adult in the house. The common phrase for it would be like teach grandma, but that's just a little simple thing that the parents can initiate. And all they have to do while they're sitting around the dinner table or getting ready for bed is just asking the kid, oh, what did you read? What did you like about it? Did you like it? These little things like that go a long way in building confidence in the student to be able to talk about things. And it doesn't interfere with them actually doing the reading. Then, as things are happening in class, you should be combining extensive reading and intensive reading in class. Make it group work more often than not, but make sure that you're providing plenty of feedback. Now, that self-study phase of extensive reading, this is probably the most basic step in planning a flipped class. It starts simply by giving your students a selection of books to choose from. So for this example, I'm going to be using the eFuture Classic Readers because I work for eFuture, and one of the editors is in attendance today, Dr. Rob Waring. So the material should be familiar. These stories are all usually stories that are in the public domain. They're fairy tales, things like that. They are graded and leveled to the appropriate level. And so they're useful for class readers, but give the students a selection to choose from, and then use a sign-up sheet so you don't forget what the students are reading. The sign-up sheet also helps you make those groups later. And then after that, let your students read. Don't restrict them. And this is something that I like to point out too, is if you want your students to be able to come back and talk about one book, but if they want to read 2, 3, 5 books, let them. Let them experiment and see how much they can read. You should never restrict a reader. And so this is an opportunity. If a student says, I want to read 2 books, let them do it. Now, after they've done their reading at home, when they come back into the class, we have to plan some activities. So we can do with these eFuture Classic Readers, we have workbooks and we have downloadable worksheets that you can use. These would typically be used as homework in an unflipped class. But in class, you can still use these worksheets where, since the students have already read and they've read more or less for pleasure, not for homework, they can then go back and do more closer intensive reading. And they can do those during reading comprehension activities and those review quizzes in class. And this allows the students to get that feedback from their classmates and from the teacher if they struggle. And what I mean by peer feedback is that the students can check each other's answers because there are a small group that have read the same story, so they're familiar with what's going on. One of the biggest types of activities that you can do is group work. So getting away from workbook pages and things like that, the books themselves have activities that we would usually put into a study phase of class. So these introductory pages that introduce the story and the characters and key vocabulary, we can turn these and make them activate phase lessons and activities. So with these introductory pages, since the students have already read, they don't need the teacher to introduce the story to them. They can instead introduce the story and the characters to their classmates. So remember, these students are broken up into groups, and each group has read a different book. So they're communicating about 2 different things with each other. And this is great because the students are driving the conversation, You're creating greater conversation in your class, but also these stories get a bit of clout because the teacher isn't saying this is a great story. The students are saying it's a great story. And that generates greater interest from their friends. If your friend says this book is good, you're more likely to pick it up. So it's just a subtle way to add that into your class. With vocabulary lessons like this, the students have already acquired the context for most of the words. And this is where that targeted feedback is really, really useful, because you don't have to review each word. You don't have to study each word. You only have to focus on the words that the students are struggling with. So that saves a bit of time. But since the students have already kind of acquired the language in context, you can let them practice with those words. So you can play vocabulary games, matching games, or memory games, things like that, using flashcards. And that is a bit more interactive, a bit more fun for the students rather than drilling. And then this prior exposure also allows the students to do things like TPR, that is student-led. So instead of having the teacher create the actions for each of these words, if you want to do that sort of TPR, you tell each group to come up with their own actions for the words that they have to study for their book. When that is done, they have more or less mastered these five words. And then they're going to teach the other classes or the other groups the actions for these words. So if you have a class of 20 students and they're divided into groups of 5, the students aren't learning just 5 words. They're now coming in contact with 20 words because each group is teaching 5 words. This is a great way to extend vocabulary and add vocabulary in a way that is not stressful. The students only have to be really concerned with five words, but they can acquire more in more fluid and natural ways. And finally, we have interactive play. So this is one that is really, really important. When I mentioned gamifying, this is one way that you could do it. You can have fun doing things with interactive play. So at the back of the classic readers, we have these things called playlets, which are scripted versions of the stories. They have directions. They have the characters being like the script and the directions and the characters all listed out very clearly. And that you can allow the students to just play along with those, with the playlet. You can do reader's theater. You can do a mini play if you want. But the students are already in their group, so they can determine how they want to do this. They get to choose which characters each person plays. They practice the actions. It's very self-directed in that way, with the teacher, again, facilitating. You can also play more general games as well, but it's with this style of class, since kids are reading different books, you can't make the games content-based or story content-based. So you can play games that are geared more towards improving literacy skills. So games that do that very well would be things like Memory, Go Fish, Old Maid, Uno, with a language angle to it, rhyming games, and then chants and songs as well. All of these things help to improve literacy skills. And incorporating these in a general sense allows the students to then take what they've learned in the games and then have that applied, or apply what they've read to those activities and those skills. Other things that the students can do, and we actually include with these books in the workbooks and the downloadable resources, things like book reports or character biographies, making comics out of the stories. These are things that are a bit more going into the cognitive development and motor skills if they're doing the plays and things like that, or the things like changing an ending to a story. They have to think about what they would change it to. And kids love doing that because they can do anything. And it's a lot of fun to watch as a teacher. Now, having talked about the flipped class, we still haven't really addressed the problem of access. And this is where digital materials come into play. First, we have to talk about traditional modes of creating access. And the way I formulate this is just with a simple abbreviation, CCTT. Collections, comfort, time, and talk. So in your class, you want to make sure that you have a library. So have a collection of books. Make sure your class is comfortable. So make sure you have a space for reading. Make sure you have time for independent reading, and make sure you have time to talk about what has been read. So CCTT, very, very simple to remember, very, very simple to incorporate once you have the books in class. Now, making a library is a little bit of a challenge for some teachers, but the best way to do it, especially for young learners, is by using graded readers. It's the most important way because there is a strategic leveling to each of the books. You can see exactly what is appropriate for the abilities of your students, but you can also add books to create more of a challenge or to be a little bit easier. So with the eFuture Classic readers here, we go from the pre-A1 level all the way up to C1, and you can mix and match these to provide greater challenge or make it easier for your students depending on their level. You can see that the headwords are pretty evenly dispersed and systematic in how they get built up and scaffolded. But also, if you have parents that are concerned about IELTS or TOEFL, you can easily show them how this would compare to the standards that they're looking for in IELTS or TOEFL or any other sort of standardized testing. Having a library like the classic readers is important as well because there are, as you can see, a lot of books. So the topics are diverse. You're going to be able to find something for just about every student. And rereadability is high too, because they're simple to read, they're fun to read, and they're quite engaging. So an example of the CCTT here is right here. The one thing that I really want to point out is when making that collection, having that library, you want to do like what I have over here, but also on screen there. You want your library to be facing forward. The students are going to be attracted to the covers, not the spines of the books. So that one slight change, it does take up a little bit more space, but that is a very easy way to attract interest, is just by having them look at the covers instead of the spines. But all of these other pictures here show the other forms of C, the other C and the other two T's. Okay. Now, I want to talk about the digital modes here. This is the important tie-all or tie together for this presentation. Using and incorporating digital modes of access with your extensive reading program can be a little tough because it takes a lot of work and it takes a lot of communication and support. But once you get the framework built up, it becomes quite smooth. So the four things that you really have to keep in mind here. If you have books in your classroom and you want to use ebooks, make sure that they are the same, make sure that they match. If you have an ebook, make sure you have the print version in class so that the students can access it in two ways. The eFuture Classic readers we have them in our e-library, but we also have them in print, so they're both readily available. Incentivize reading outside of the classroom. And I know that this might be a little bit of a contentious point because some people are very in favor of creating reward systems and other people are not because they lose their power over time. But the thing about reading is reading eventually becomes the reward itself. So as the rewards that you give out lose their weight, the reading replaces that. But you also want to connect students to their passions and interests. Reading doesn't stop with the graded readers. And if you notice a student is interested in something, you can direct them to those other resources. And I think that's really useful. And digital modes of connection are really, really important. And I'll get into that. And then finally, the last thing is, whenever possible, be digital without needing the internet, because we can't always guarantee that a student has internet access or has great internet access. A quick example of that, During the COVID pandemic, a study took place in Arizona. And it was revealed that 350,000 households didn't have an internet subscription. That's 13% of households in Arizona. That's a lot. And the children that lived in those households, they weren't all households with kids, but many of them had children. Many of them were poor immigrants as well. These are the kids that need English education the most. But when schools and libraries closed and they have to stay at home to do their study, but they don't have internet, they are effectively cut off from any major form of education. And that becomes a huge, huge problem. So being able to fill that gap is always useful. So let's talk about incentives. I don't need to talk about point number one because it's pretty simple, but the incentives are a great starter. And an incentive doesn't have to be like a prize, a sticker, candy, anything like that. Reading itself can seem like a reward. If you make reading seem like an alternative to doing schoolwork, then the students are going to be excited to read. So doing things like drop everything and read, that becomes a reward in a classroom. Using delayed gratification systems is very, very critical. That's what got me reading. I worked for 3 months to get Giants tickets. I didn't get those tickets because the MLB went on strike, but I kept reading. And so even though I didn't get the final reward, it still worked out. And like I said, eventually reading becomes the reward on its own. But also incentives create accountability and tracking. So if you have a reward system, you are able to better track what your students are reading, how much they're reading, how often. And there are plenty of digital resources for that. One really nice one is called Beanstack, which you can see on the screen here. And it has an app that students can use. They scan the ISBNs of the books that they're reading, or they can manually enter them in. And then the app has a timer. It has a tracker for how many pages they've read, or how long they're reading, how many books they've read, how often. And it provides rewards based off of that in the form of like badges and things like that. So you have these digital systems that help create accountability, but they also incentivize reading in a different way. Connecting reading to passions and interests is also important. Start with graded readers, but also curate books based on students' interests. For me, one of the best things that happened at school was the Scholastic Book Fair. I didn't ever have money to buy books, but being able to go and look at the different books and be like, oh, that looks interesting, allowed me to then go to the library and find those books for free. But when you have the graded readers, that's the start, that's the foundation, but getting them to other forms of resources will help build that confidence and independence. Connecting reading to pleasure is also great and easy to do with social media. I'm sure many of you maybe use Goodreads. I am devoted to Goodreads, but that's a very useful social media site that is free and easy to create accounts for your students. But in short, the more encounters that students have with books, the greater likelihood they are at finding that home run book. And once they get that home run book, it's easier to get them hooked on reading and to accelerate their reading adventure. Now, I mentioned Goodreads because Goodreads is a way to involve everyone. And when you use digital spaces for extensive reading, you want to make sure that you as the teacher are participating in it, but also have the parents participate if they can, along with the students. So don't leave the students and abandon the students online and social media spaces. That's not going to help them. But with things like Goodreads, you can create private discussion groups with your students that allows you to ask questions to your students, to make book recommendations, and to also just keep parents in the loop on what's going on. And you can do all of that with Goodreads, and just as long as you're talking with families, it'll work out pretty well. And again, this goes back to encouraging family reading time, because when the students they're creating shelves of books and things like that, they are able to create all sorts of new adventures and ideas and find new inspirations. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about is the on-the-go e-library. And this is what I mean when we create something that uses digital media but does not use the internet. So eFuture is using this device called the on-the-go e-library, or OTG for short, which is a USB device that we take and put the e-library onto it. You can then plug this USB with the e-library into a phone or a computer, a tablet, whatever, and the students or whoever has the USB has access to all of the ebooks in our e-library. You don't need the internet to access it. It's like using a Kindle without, after you've loaded your books, you preload the books onto the Kindle and then you can take it anywhere else. It's the same idea. It's just much smaller. And then when you are connected to the internet, you can use it to send messages and write book reports and things like that, or update the e-library with new books or change books, things like that too. So this is one device that is really, we hope is going to be really helpful for students in areas where the internet isn't very consistent, it's not very stable, or they just don't have internet at home. And we hope that this is a way to allow them to read more extensively. And when you use the OTG with a flipped class, it makes it a lot more possible for them to read more often. So I have a little bit of time, so I'm just going to quickly wrap things up. Basically, just remember that using the flipped class with an extensive reading program is pretty effective at maximizing extensive reading for your students. Digital reading materials increase the effectiveness of a flipped class, but it also increases reading enthusiasm because they have access in more places. We need to make access for our readers. Books are not always cheap, and so any way that they can get them is great. Digital technology can be used to keep students in touch with reading, even when they're not reading books. So using things like social media to get them to communicate about what they read or what they want to read. This keeps reading on their minds so that when they can get to that book, they are able to enjoy it. But also choose graded readers to start with, because they can be accessed in print and digitally. They're leveled appropriately, and they're quite useful, and they're really fun. Now, I keep mentioning this idea of the home run book a lot, and the reason is because there's proof to it. There's evidence of it, that even just a few, and this is going back to a study that Dr. Krashen participated in, these books that you come in contact with, even one book is enough to create a reader for life. And what that book is very, very varied. My first home run book probably might be a book that you don't even enjoy, but everybody has that book, and everybody has multiple books. So the more access you create, the more likely it is that these students are able, or any reader really, is able to find that home run book. And even so, one might expect that in low income areas and disadvantaged schools, because they have less access to books, except in extreme cases, you would think that there are fewer home run book opportunities, but really students will find a way they'll find something that really resonates with them if you give them the chance to. So, and for me, in 1994 in context, Matt Williams, my favorite baseball player, he hit 43 home runs in 112 games. The season was cut short, and he was on pace to break then Roger Maris's single season home run record. I was on pins and needles watching him play, and he didn't accomplish his goal. My goal was to go see a Giants game that year, and I didn't accomplish that goal, but I did hit one home run, and that was the story of Ferdinand, and that changed the trajectory of my life without me ever realizing it. So that is where I will stop, and I will say thank you to everybody for listening to me ramble. And if you need to contact me, please feel free to reach out to me here.
Thank you so much, Joseph. I've been actively watching the chat. We don't really have many questions, but a whole lot of people have comments showing how much this resonates with them. I'm going to turn off the live streaming and then open up the floor